The closing months of World War II and the aftermath leave a vacuum. It's a vacuum in which the winning powers will have to work out a post-war future, and it's a future that for a time looks perilous. So how close did the world come to further mass conflict in 1945? Weary and worn, impoverished but undaunted and now triumphant, we had a moment that was sublime. Yet it may well be that there were few whose hearts were more heavily burdened with anxiety than mine. Now that's a quote from Winston Churchill's memoirs, and it describes his feelings following the end of World War II. Though victorious, it's now unclear what that actually meant. Britain fought the war for the same reason they'd fought countless wars before it, mainly to stop a dominant power emerging in Europe. This has been British policy for centuries, and it didn't matter who the enemy was. It could be France, the Habsburgs, whoever. In the old world, dominant powers always sought to protect their position, and now all three victors would likely want to preserve theirs. Now, a few months before the war in Europe actually ends, in February 1945, the three leaders, Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt, engage in a power play, ready for the spoils of war, in what we now know as the Yalta Conference. Now, while the war is still ongoing at this point, the aim of the conference is to outline a post-war settlement, as the Axis defeat is deemed inevitable at this point. But each of the respective allies held opposing views, had opposing interests and ideologies. From a military standpoint, it could certainly be argued that Stalin is ahead of the Western allies at this point. The Anglo-American forces had, as of February 1945, stalled. They had yet to cross the River Rhine, while the Soviet forces had pushed the Germans all the way back from Stalingrad and were now just 80 kilometers from Berlin. Indeed, the conference itself takes place in the Soviet Union. Churchill has to travel there, though he's very ill, and Roosevelt is even more unwell. He's ravaged by polio, is unable to walk and barely has the strength to lift up his arm. Both of the leaders have had to fly the long and risky trip, and it isn't even Stalin who greets them at the airport, but Molotov. This could, though it's debatable, be an indicator of Stalin's strength at this point in the conflict. The three leaders would not be negotiating alone. Each of them would have their own advisors who would help them argue their case, and all three would have to pick their battles very carefully. What we need to do is imagine a pre-war world, and there we see opposing figures, each with ambitions and ideologies. Now, the war effectively removes three of these figures, so it's up to the rest to work out a post-war peace, if it's possible. So, for these initial discussions, it does appear that it is Stalin who's in the driving seat. He demands maximum reparations from Germany, which is something that worries Churchill and Roosevelt. Germany now lies in ruins, and if its people are left to be pillaged and starved, it will ultimately be left to the Western Allies to foot the bill, meaning the Western Allies would be paying Stalin reparations by proxy. But their response angers Stalin. The Soviet Union has been ravaged by the war, and he's suspicious. Why don't the Western counterparts want to help him rebuild the USSR? The suspicions and fears are already at play. Churchill's big fear regarding Stalin is that he will impose communism on the countries he now occupies, and without the US, and now weakened Britain would be helpless to stop it. The war has bankrupted Britain, and its decline as a superpower now seems complete. With regards to reparations, Stalin demands 10 billion, and no one says anything. This prompts Stalin to believe that it's been agreed. But, like so much discussed at this conference, there is a problem. Germany couldn't pay such a bill even if they wanted to, and this means the payment is taken in kind with the dismantling of German industry. Now, Roosevelt remains famously silent. He's not happy about the outcome of much of the meetings, but at the same time he does not have the energy to oppose Stalin. His forces are still fighting in the east against Japan, so he wants help from Stalin to bring the war to a close. But in return, Stalin wants not just Japanese territory, but Chinese territory too, and China is an ally. Here's a quote by Roosevelt's interpreter regarding the situation. Stalin said that it was clear that if these conditions were not met, it would be difficult for him and Molotov to explain to the people why the Soviet Union was entering the war against Japan. If political conditions were met, the people would realise the national interests involved, and it would be much easier to explain the decision to the Supreme Soviet. Actually, the Supreme Soviet had no power whatsoever. Everybody knew that all power in the Soviet Union resided in Stalin. It was obvious that he, Roosevelt, was bothered by what he was doing. But for Roosevelt, concessions are now deemed necessary. He intends to sort out the issues with China after the war, but for now he will have to betray his ally. For Churchill too, concessions must be made, and he has to stomach the reality that Eastern Europe will continue to be occupied by Stalin. Again, it's all ideology at play. The Western Allies don't want communism to expand, and Stalin doesn't want the West to expand. Effectively, he wants a buffer zone to protect his country from invasion. And this means installing communist governments in the occupied territories. But this isn't what the West wants, nor what they'd fought the war for. It's also little consolation to Churchill that the country that Britain had gone to war for now lies in ruins and would go on to be denied democratic elections. Churchill does attempt to insist that Poland is guaranteed free elections, but like with so many things discussed at this conference, it's an empty promise. All agreements are precarious and peace is fragile.
Can I have Romania?
Sure. Okay.
Can we jump on your belly?
Nevertheless, the three men put on a brave smile for the camera. These are the images that will go out to the world, but in large part it's all for show. The threats and fear remain. For Stalin, war is not on the cards. In his words, everybody is fed up with war, and he anticipates it will be at least another 20 years before another mass outbreak of conflict occurs. Countries now would need to rebuild and re-establish themselves. Even if a war was deemed necessary, no one was going to fight it. Stalin also wished to consolidate his gains and rebuild his military, and that was going to take time, and he begins in earnest. Just weeks after the Yalta Conference, he initiates a power grab in occupied Romania, and this prompts a large telegram from Roosevelt to Stalin. Roosevelt now becomes disillusioned. Despite his array of compromises and willingness to appease Stalin, hopes of a post-war peace appear thin, and he dies just 11 days after sending the telegram. Churchill was also becoming increasingly anxious around this time. We have to remember that he'd had to contend with the Polish government in London, who were appalled at the British betrayal and the fact that what was left of the nation would now be handed to one of the two nations who'd invaded them in the first place in 1939. Churchill clearly felt guilty. He knew that Stalinist rule would not be kind to the Polish people and offered them British citizenship, but many just seen this as an admission of failure. The complex nature of World War II meant that countries often only allied themselves to one side or the other simply because of geography or circumstance. Smaller countries like Romania would switch sides with regards to who was winning, French soldiers fought alongside Germany after they were defeated, and the Soviet Union found themselves on both sides. So the Allied victors was not exactly a match made in heaven. And pretty quickly the obvious differences for power and outlook between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies emerge. By the summer of 1945, Stalin is actually making moves on Austria, and Churchill is at his wit's end at this point, and this pushes him to actually initiate plans for Operation Unthinkable, a plan of attack on the Soviet Union. Another war. This wasn't just a thought or an idea, but a plan outlined by the British Chiefs of Staff. But there was a problem. This time Britain could not go it alone, at all, and would need guarantees from the US before they outlined anything. Even with US backing, such an undertaking would be another huge fight, and there's a problem for Churchill. The US don't want another war. Neither Roosevelt or his successor, Harry Truman, the man who succeeded Roosevelt after his death in April 1945, wanted war. Nor were they preoccupied with Soviet domination in the East. From their perspective, imperialism and communism were both flawed practices, and if the Soviets did gain more power, then Britain would just have to accept it. And America's view ultimately made Churchill's plan unworkable, as Walker points out. Unthinkable made a huge assumption that the United States would be a full and willing partner in the enterprise to attack the Soviet Union. But it wasn't. So Churchill's plan for another war was for the birds, and in July 1945 he was actually voted out of office, with the UK electorate electing Labour leader Clement Attlee as Prime Minister. You have to remember that by now Britain itself was more a side player and ally to the United States, and the real tension was between the two new world superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The new president, Harry Truman, is not really an average politician. He's blunt and to the point, but he's not really as diplomatic as his predecessor, and he quickly takes a hard stance against Stalin. He actually openly admits to Stalin that the US has nuclear capability during the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, and he also gets rid of Roosevelt's advisors, whom he considers to be too friendly towards Stalin. For Stalin, this is obviously bad news, and the news that the US has nuclear weapons worries him, which consequently leads to the Soviet Union speeding up their own nuclear program. So, while Stalin certainly would have had some intelligence of the US atomic project, it's not known if he knew the full extent of America's development until Truman told him face to face. Truman will go on to change the US opinion of Stalin, who at this point is still looked upon by many Americans as a great ally, the man who'd helped win them the war. At this point, the US had just had 4 years of propaganda portraying Joseph Stalin as a friend, but now that will change. In a clever piece of politics, Truman actually invites Churchill, who's now out of office, to do the dirty work for him and make the speech that will astonish the US public in March 1946.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
The speech provokes an outcry, and the bitterness of both sides towards each other grows. So, luckily, we didn't see World War III in 1945. America didn't want it, and Britain didn't have the power anymore to initiate it. However, had Churchill had his way, and Operation Unthinkable had been backed by the Americans, we might well have just had World War III in 1945. Now, as to how that would have gone, I don't think we can really know for sure, but I do think it probably would have been won by the Western Allies, if only down to their sheer industrial capacity, but it did have the potential to spiral out of control like World War II, becoming another long-lasting mass conflict. The tension was definitely there, but the willingness for war had gone, at least with the major two powers who were still in the game. But even without World War III, Europe did remain divided. Tensions would last for decades, and the Cold War that followed initiated lots of smaller proxy wars that took millions of casualties along the way. But after 1945, and with Britain no longer a power, a mixture of weapons, geography and ideology would set the stage for a new type of conflict.